One of the original settlers of Topsfield was Zacchaeus Gould, who came from England in 1638. Our barn was built by his grandson, John Gould, in about 1710 on what is now Washington Street. It is one of the oldest barns in the country, and there is some evidence that some of the timbers came from Topsfield's first meeting house, which was bought by John Gould when the selectmen decided to build a new meeting house on the common in 1703. One or two beams of our barn may date from before 1663. During the Revolution, the barn was owned by Captain Joseph Gould, John Gould's grandson, who was a farmer and the captain of Topsfield Militia, which saw service on April 19th, 1775. Barn ownership remained in the Gould family until 1872, when Timothy Fuller took possession. In 1940, it was transferred to the Abbott family, and in 1968 to the Schiff family. The photograph shows the barn in 1900. In the spring of 1983, after decades of use, the barn was in great need of major repairs, and the Schiffs offered it to the Historical Society, including the costs associated with a careful disassembly. The Society accepted the generous offer, and the barn came down. All the old timbers were carefully identified and marked by Len Berkston to permit a later reconstruction. Between 1983 and 1995, the barn beams were stored, as it happens, in 3 different locations. In 1993, the Society began planning for the re-erection of the barn on the Capon property. President Norm Eisler led a 12-member committee in planning the work and engaged Society member Ben Nutter to formulate the architectural design details. For many months, regular meetings of the committee were held in the Capon House Library to organize and to accomplish the project. Towards the conclusion of the planning stage, the committee consisted of Norm Eisler, chairman, Ben Nutter, architect, plus Barbara Carpenter, Bill Whiting, and Jan Jansen. The cost estimate for the project was $170,000, assuming that much of the work would be done by volunteers. Fundraising efforts were launched, numerous permits had to be negotiated, an archaeological survey was required because of the site was a national landmark, and all the old timbers were sent to East Greensboro, Vermont, where preservation carpenter Jan Lewandowski repaired them as necessary for reuse. 4 objectives were defined for the project. The pine, both inside and outside, with about 2 inches of foam insulation and an airspace in between. The roof is constructed similarly, except that the outside consists of cedar shakes. 2 gas-fired heaters are located in a 50-inch crawl space under the barn. Number 2, to provide a display area for artifacts, and number 3, to provide room for our historical records and some storage space. This was accomplished by adding a rear extension to the barn. Extensions were frequently added to older barns in the 19th century. We started out by planning for historical displays in the barn, with the idea that these had to be made movable to permit freeing up the space when that was necessary. That was one reason for the storage space requirement. It soon became clear that this was rather impractical, and so later exhibits were all wall-mounted. Finally, number 4, to provide a space for society meetings and community functions, and this has become the barn's principal use. Such activities require kitchen and lavatory facilities, and these are provided for in a side extension to the barn. Many functions have been held in the barn since 1997, and the rental fees have been of considerable help to the Society in maintaining the property. After a brief look at a recent Society meeting, we shall begin at the beginning to follow the construction of the barn between 1995 and 1997. Much of the new lumber for the barn was Topsfield grown. A portable sawmill was set up at the Capon house to cut the pine logs from the cemetery into boards. After the men were finished with this log, there were many more to do, as you can see. John Nutter in his truck helped to clear the site. Scott Dwinell had two large oak trees on his property on Salem Road, where he wished to build a garage. They were taken down, sawed into boards, and allowed to dry for about a year. The boards were used later to make the floor in our barn. We see Scott scoring the tree, and Norm Eisler, Bill Whiting, and John Nutter cutting the trunk into 12-foot sections.
get that. I guess this is as good a place as any. So here we go. Joyce? Oh, one other thing. Joyce, come on over here.
No, I know. I've already been wet. Thank you.
I'm going to have you use this other shovel. Come on. This is a Gould descendants shovel. Gould the blacksmith. Some of the residents here, I'm sure, remember him. And John Nutter has come up with one of his shovels. So that's what we're going to use to have the second groundbreaking here. Joyce, want to use this? Great. Okay. Very good. Okay. Good show.
Good show. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. We'll get on with the earth moving now.
Why am I talking? I pushed it.
I don't know.
We did it!
We're committed.
You ought to get a picture of that. We did it.
Did it yet?
The completed foundation came into view after the forms were removed. Entrance provisions were made for the underground services. Then came the first work that required a number of volunteers, putting the Douglas fir support beams in place. These beams weighed more than 400 pounds, and the volunteers used techniques that were probably familiar to the builders of the pyramids. Finally, after all the beams were in place, precisely located and leveled, here we see Larry Shirk working in the area of the rear extension, cutting floor joists for that part of the project, while Norm Eisler and Carl Porter are deciding where to locate the trap door to the basement. and an assistant are placing field stones on an indented section of the concrete foundation so that when completed, the barn will appear to be resting on a fieldstone foundation. At this point, the plywood barn floor is in, the fieldstone foundation has been completed, and the volunteers are busy shaping the posts for the rear extension.
Came up rather than forward because I've been sitting down. I'm quite elderly, but you'd never know it if you get to know me real well. The thing that pleases me most so far today is seeing Norm looking so well. I've been down here observing him and his men working, and I never saw anything quite like it. For people to do that work so long, and I thought it was a little too bad we didn't have a pub in town they could all go to and get some refreshment. But then I remembered our lovely druggist who has all sorts of liniments and pills to sell. So he's handy, and no doubt his business has picked up considerably for all those people. Well, I'm going to generalize a little bit. I have many things written out that he's already said so well, and I won't be needing to repeat them. But I have a few ideas that may be original, maybe a little foolish. But the first one is, I'm pretty convinced that Parson Capon is a spectral person up above us. He's here in spirit somewhere. I don't know just where. I believe in those things. Perhaps a spiritualist medium might bring him down to tell us what he really is thinking about today. But I venture to say he's very, very happy to see this barn, which is larger than he had. All his was very large, as you remember from whatever he said. I have here that what he had was, well, Norm, I guess, said it some 90 feet long, not when he had it, but however, it was a great big barn, and this is bigger still. But he needed it because he had a growing family, and it was his source of income, among other things. And also, he used to entertain in his house all his committee members. And I think what will be happening in the future, not only what Norm said about organizations using this wonderful structure, but the parson probably would say, oh boy, if I ever had all that room that I could talk to my people in, now that's where I'd be putting them.
In the old days, a farmer would enlist aid from all his friends in raising the framework for a barn. We did not do that. We engaged a professional crew. In our case, Jan Lewandowski and his team of restoration carpenters from Vermont, assisted by a crane operator, did the work. Clearly, this was not a job for volunteers. In addition, it was important to subject the ancient timbers to minimum stress. These video clips illustrate how the crew assembled the framework using pegs to interlock the beams.
The end of our building right there. Going that way. Oh, going that way. You want to go a little higher? Yeah, I think I'll go higher than that.
After the main frame was erected, the crew began on the supports for the roof. When the roof rafters were in place, the ridgepole was added. The young man on the left is Jan Lewandowski. Siding of the barn began in October with the objective of having the barn closed in completely by winter. The inside siding boards were all shiplapped. Thus, should the barn board shrink, the inner wall layer of insulation would not be visible from inside the barn. Here one can see how the foam insulation was applied. At this point, much of the insulation is still piled up outside. And finally, work on the roof. This was done by a professional roofer. By the middle of November 1995, the barn was closed in, just in time as it turned out, because by the end of the month we had our first snowstorm. In January of 1996, we got a lot more snow, so that during the rest of the winter our work was limited to inside projects. The outside work resumed in the spring after the weather improved. The remaining insulation was applied, followed by the vertical pine siding. We see here Lee Marchand, a retired builder, up on the scaffold, and Dick Carlson cutting the boards to the required lengths. They did most of this work. When the outside work was mostly done, the volunteers turned their attention to the interior work. We see here the kitchen after the wallboard had been installed, and a start was made on the cabinets. 2 handicapped accessible lavatories were also included in the side extension to the barn. The oak boards were sent to a mill for surfacing to a standard thickness before installation in the barn. The floors in the kitchen, the entryway, the lavatories, and the records room were tiled. Provision for necessary barn services were made in September and October of 1996. They are all underground connections made through the openings in the foundation that we saw earlier. Having a kitchen and lavatory facilities requires having a disposal system. Our system borders on what might be required for a restaurant, just because from time to time we might serve between 50 and 100 people from our kitchen. Perk test results indicated that a pump-up system was required with some 800 yards of fill over the disposal field. A gas line was brought into the barn from Howlett Street to serve two gas-fired furnaces operating a forced hot air system. These furnaces do not require a chimney. The exhaust exits through the rear basement wall via plastic pipes. The furnaces are installed in the basement, one for the main barn and the other for the extensions. Electric power, telephone, and a security system also enter the building via underground conduits. Services for the Capon House are coordinated with those for the barn. Here we see the water line being installed. It is a 4-inch pipe, very large, because that is what is required by the sprinkler system. The entire building is protected. The system was designed for minimum visibility. There are also sprinkler heads in the basement, under the floor. A quick look at the basement from just below the trap door. The heating ducts and the sprinkler system are most visible, along with some leftover construction material. The furnaces are at the far end under the kitchen.
Congratulations.
Right. Cheers. They're a fantastic group,
Yes,
I
two
think.
of them.
Well, that's about what. Gee, you're stealing my words. Yeah, I was going to offer a toast to the volunteers, most of whom are here now.
I think we ought to offer a toast to Norm Iser. If he hasn't been here, it's never been here.
That's absolutely for sure.
I'll drink to that too. But thank you all, guys. Did a great job.
He's the, what do you call it, a kingpin?
You're the captains.
Well, I think it turned out really great. It looks much bigger. It's so much nicer than they would have had at that time.
You know, it's funny, since the beginning of
And
It
you
looked big.
know,
people at first said,
yeah. These are,
you know, when we laid it out,
you know, these are the original
Big on the table.
had to have been this big
What did he get?
without the things.
Getting it. Taking Glenn Bergson.
occupancy permit will say 75. If you have a wedding reception, we can stand down in front. You're probably going to earn 75 there, so. For seating for dinner,
For meeting, lined up chairs.
we're planning on about 9 tables.
A view of the finished oak floor in the rear extension, and a demonstration by Dick Carlson on how one enters and leaves the basement.
gain enough income to have it carry itself for the cost of insurance, the heat, the power, and the rest of it, the security system and what have you. So if you would look over the list, and if there's anything there that would interest you in making a donation, I'm sure it would be gratefully accepted by our erstwhile treasurer, who unfortunately is not here tonight, recovered from open heart surgery. He's doing well. Carl Ford. Yeah, you can pay for font on something here also. As my wife points out. Speaking of Carl Ford, I sent a letter that he wrote just this evening to the Historical Society from Carl and Dottie Fuller. We are enclosing a check to be used if accepted, and we sure will accept it, by the Topsfield Historical Society to seed a fund for the completion of the Gould Barn kitchen. We would hope that this would encourage others to contribute to this fund, and thereby allow the board of directors to purchase items for the kitchen like a dishwasher, stoneware, flatware, and basic utensils to make the kitchen more useful for the society. When this goal is reached, as determined by the directors, any remaining funds would then be placed in a category in the treasurer's records to be applied for furnishings and/or maintenance of the Gould Barn. Signed by the board. Dated today. Very nice. Thank you, Paul. See, another donation that just showed up was this lectern. Came in about 2 days ago. A fellow named Jan Jansen made it. And he's made a few other things. He made the racks for the chairs. He's busy making some of the displays for the History of Topsfield exhibit that will be in the barn here at some point in the future. And Jan, where are you? Okay. Oh, there it is. On your 53rd wedding anniversary.
Whose wedding anniversary?
Actually, it's Wednesday.
It's yours?
Yeah.
We also have the Ways and Means table set up in the corner over here. If there's anything there that might interest you, the Ways and Means committee would be appreciative of that.
The reconstruction of the Gould Barn on the Capon site is the most ambitious undertaking by the Topsfield Historical Society since the restoration of the Capon House in 1913. The project enjoyed financial support from many people, businesses, and foundations. The work was accomplished by many volunteers working under the able leadership of the Society's president, Norman Eisler, who gave unsparingly of his time and energy.